12 noon on the 20th of July 1944, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg entered the office complex of Field Marshal Keitel at Wolfschanze, the Führer's headquarters for the Eastern Front in East Prussia. He was scheduled to report to Hitler on the readiness of the Home Army. Keitel informed the officers that the briefing would not take place in the bunker as usual, but in the nearby conference room of the Lagerbaracke, the situation barracks. Keitel beckoned the officers to follow him, but Stauffenberg stopped and asked if he could change his shirt. Keitel's aide, John von Freyend, took him to a nearby room. While Stauffenberg was inside, the phone rang. It was General Feldgiebel, head of the communications post. Stauffenberg said he'd call back as soon as possible. Keitel became impatient. Stauffenberg emerged at last, and the officers continued on their way to the conference room on the other side of the inner security zone. At 12:35 p.m., Stauffenberg entered the conference room. Exactly 7 minutes later, the world would be forever changed. One of the most astonishing chapters in the history of the Second World War had begun. An assassination attempt on the Führer by a group of senior officers at the very pinnacle of German military might. Operation Valkyrie.
The Valkyrie plan was an official German plan for dealing with some sort of massive internal disturbance within Germany, whether it might be an uprising of foreign labourers or a particularly concentrated air raid which sort of disrupts local services and everything else.
It turns out that in 1944 there were 7.5 million foreign workers in Germany. And the Germans had this worry that there could be a civil disturbance.
Unter dem Motto Valkyrie war geplant ein Aufstand, falls ein Aufstand der Fremdarbeiter käme. Fremdarbeiter in allen Betrieben, Landwirtschaft, Industrie, gab es sehr viele ausländische Arbeiter. Wenn die einen Aufstand planten, sollte der mit dem, unter dem Stichwort Valkyrie niedergeschlagen werden. In jedem Korps waren Vorbereitungen getroffen für diesen Zweck.
The reserve army troops, with officers at the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin, were the men designated to execute Operation Valkyrie.
The circles of the resistance in the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin were the ones that were in control of that plan. So it seemed very logical for them to turn that operational plan to their own devices.
Also in Berlin was a young officer serving on the general staff of the German High Command, Klaus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg. The von Stauffenberg family was one of the oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families of southern Germany. Both Klaus' father, Alfred, and his mother, Caroline, were nobility of rank. Caroline had already presented her husband with 2 sons, the twins, Berthold and Alexander. In November 1907, when she was 8 months into her next pregnancy, she decided to travel to Stauffenberg Castle in Jettingen.
Seine Mutter hat ihre Schwiegermutter hier besucht und dabei kam dann Klaus eben auf die Welt und ein Bruder von ihm, Konrad, es waren auch Zwillinge, genau wie die ersten Brüder von ihm, waren ja auch Zwillinge.
Konrad died shortly after birth, but Klaus survived. For the next 10 years, the 3 boys grew up in the privileged comfort of the German nobility under Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Lautlingen estate, some 50 miles south of Stuttgart, was the home where Klaus grew up and later lived with his family. In 1914, Germany had declared war on both France and Russia. Caroline took tea to the soldiers passing through the local train station, and in the summer urged her sons to help the local women, now deprived of their menfolk, with the harvest. In his spare time, Claus read and learned to play the cello, so that he and his brothers could perform as a trio sonatas by Mozart and Haydn. The day they learned that Germany had requested an armistice, Claus was in tears.
And he was, of course, still a boy when that war ended, in Germany's defeat and in the national, what was so seen by so many people, including Stauffenberg's family, as the national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
Germany was in a state of siege, as various mobs, communist or right-wing, vied for power. This turmoil prepared the way for the rise of the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler. The political upheaval of those years made a powerful impression on Claus. He resolved to become an officer, for he believed that the officer corps had always served as a powerful, stabilizing force in German life. In 1926, he joined the family's traditional regiment, the 17th Cavalry Regiment in Bamberg. Claus had grown to be a tall and strikingly handsome young man with a shock of dark hair, prominent cheekbones, a firm jaw and dreamy eyes.
Ein sehr, sehr beeindruckender Mensch. Er hat eine ganz große Ausstrahlung gehabt. Er war irgendwie sehr, sehr herzlich, sehr auf jemanden zugehen.
A very devout Catholic, he always attended Mass on Sunday.
Irgendwo war eine Zeit lang in Bamberg stationiert beim Reiterregiment 17, wo er auch eingetreten ist. Und da lag ganz nah von Bamberg lag der Besitz meines Großvaters und war dann, sagen wir, ich war dann auch immer wieder eingeladen zu dem Winterball in Bamberg beim Regiment.
One day, he met a pretty young 16-year-old called Nina. She was at a local girls' boarding school. In 1930, after he had been promoted to second lieutenant, Claus proposed to Nina, even though he was only 23. On the 26th of September 1933, 8 months after Hitler became Chancellor, Nina and Claus were married at St. James Church in Bamberg. He was in uniform and wore his steel helmet to the ceremony. To wed is to be on duty, he explained to Nina. In 1936, Claus took the entrance exams to Berlin's prestigious War Academy. Berthold von Stauffenberg had also moved to Berlin with his new wife Mika, while his cousin, Count Caesar von Hofacker, lived in Berlin on the Kaiser Wilhelmstrasse.
My father was a direct cousin of Count Claus Stauffenberg. My grandmother and the mother of Claus Stauffenberg were sisters. So there was a very close relationship. And I think that had definitely something to do that my father ended up in the resistance.
His military career progressed rapidly. In 1937, he became a cavalry captain, and in 1938, he was assigned as a general staff officer to the 1st Light Division, later known as the 6th Panzer Division. That same year, the SA and SS launched the so-called Kristallnacht, when shops and homes of Jews were smashed, and many synagogues were burned to the ground.
Da war ich 8 damals. In dem Zusammenhang haben sie ja auch jüdische Wohnungen gestürmt, haben die Sachen rausgeschmissen auf die Straße, haben sie verbrannt, haben geplündert.
Stauffenberg had supported the idea of restricting Jewish influence in the arts and public life, but he strongly condemned this action. His gradual disillusionment with the Nazi regime had irrevocably begun. Stauffenberg was serving as quartermaster of the 1st Light Division when Hitler decided to invade Poland in September of 1939.
He said in response to one attempt to motivate him to help overthrow Hitler in November 1939, "I'm not ready yet." What does that mean? He was a captain at the time. He was a captain in the general staff. How many opportunities to oppose a dictator and a commander-in-chief are open to a captain?
Stauffenberg's entire ethos was that the army was there to uphold and defend Germany, and therefore he was a very loyal member of the army that went into Poland in 1939. Germany was now in a war. This was the regime that was leading Germany, and he, I think, believed to some extent this war had been in a way forced upon Germany, that it wasn't solely down to Hitler's crazy foreign policy.
By that time, Hitler was already plotting the invasion of the Low Countries and France. On the 10th of May, Stauffenberg was with 6th Panzer as its tanks plunged into Luxembourg and Belgium, creating the spearhead of the 6 armored divisions that crossed the Meuse and raced across France. French resistance crumbled more quickly than division headquarters in the rear could keep track of. 1 week later, to his infinite disappointment, Stauffenberg was withdrawn from the front and promoted to the Army General Staff. Before taking up his new post, Stauffenberg found time to see his family. He was now the proud father of 3 children, Franz Ludwig, Heimermann, and Berthold, named after his elder brother. 1 year later, Nina had their 4th, a girl they called Valerie. From his perch at the Army General Staff, Stauffenberg witnessed the invasion of the Soviet Union. But it was not until later, in 1941, that news of the systematic killing of Jews and Gypsies by SS troops reached the higher levels of the Wehrmacht.
Und dann bin ich verwundet worden vor Moskau und kam dann, weil ich noch nicht vollverwendungsfähig war, als Ordnanzoffizier zur Crew. Und dort kam eine der ersten Meldungen aus dem rückwärtigen Bereich, was der SS unterstand, eben diese Meldung am Schluss der ganzen Meldungen, er hätte 5 Zigeuner sonderbehandelt. Sie hatten da 5 Zigeuner sonderbehandelt. Was haben sie mit denen gemacht? Ja, die haben wir erschossen. Wieso erschossen? Nach einem kriegsgerichtlichen Urteil? Nein. Alle Zigeuner und Juden erschießen wir. Das war das erste Mal, dass ich das authentisch gehört hatte von einem hohen SS-Führer, der zuständig war. Das hat mich sehr umgetrieben.
You know, the early days of the Russian campaign, the Holocaust was ongoing at that point, and it tended to be a very, very brutal affair. This is not the later supposedly humane gassings at Auschwitz and everything else. This was very, very brutal. You know, pits dug and civilians lined up and shot into them. So it was dreadful what was going on. And reports of each of these atrocities would obviously go up through the military lines.
If one looks at the total number of Jews, for example, who are exterminated in the Holocaust, by far the largest number come from what was the former Soviet Union, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and places like that. And those are the areas that the Germans occupy in the summer and fall of 1941. And truly horrible things happened there, large-scale killings and the like.
Da hat es der Major von Gersdorf und noch einer, die im Hubschrauber über die Gegenstadt geflogen waren, gesehen, wie ein riesen Grab war und da Leute erschossen wurden. Es wurden dann 8000 Juden, hatte die lettische SS erschossen. Ich war damals 25 Jahre alt. Wen sollte ich fragen? Ach, da kam nur der Oberst von Tresco in Frage. Das war ein väterlicher Freund, 1A der Heeresgruppe, also Geschäftsführer des Stabes, wenn man so sagen will.
Major General Henning von Tresco, who was serving on the Eastern Front in the Heeresgruppe Mitte, had been plotting Hitler's overthrow since the late 1930s.
Aber er hat innerhalb der Heeresgruppe Mitte eigentlich versucht, ein Zentrum zu sammeln von Leuten, auf die er sich verlassen konnte. Das war eigenartigerweise auch relativ bekannt.
Und da gab es damals so eine Sprache, die man sich angewöhnt hat, wo man rausfand, ob einer Nazi war oder nicht. Und ich wusste, er war kein Nazi. Ich bewunderte seine Intelligenz. Und dann ging man so um 11 Uhr abends rüber. Da war Tresco häufig am Schachspiel zur Erholung, seiner Erholung. Und dann wurde besprochen, wie das Attentat durchgeführt wurde. Wie ich hinkam, 1942, war gar keine Frage mehr, dass ein Attentat, sondern nur wie.
Von Tresco understood that the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front had a unique opportunity to incubate a conspiracy, given its independence from the SD, the Gestapo, and the SS. In July of 1941, von Tresco received a visitor from the General Staff, Stauffenberg. The young officer agreed with Tresco that Hitler was a danger, but he was not yet ready to join the conspiracy. As late as the second half of 1942, during one of his fact-finding tours in Ukraine, Stauffenberg remained convinced that the Eastern Front could be held. But in that same year, Stauffenberg received the first reports of the mass murder of Russian Jews by SS Special Forces, known as Einsatztruppen.
And he got wind of these and was astonished and horrified that this was going on in Germany's name. And in effect, as I say, I think that is where his real conversion to the cause comes from.
Some of his religious background, as a Catholic, there's always a greater authority. Yeah, there's a greater authority than your Führer. Yeah. All this came together then and made a loyal member of the officer caste into a rebel.
He began a one-man campaign to convince commanders at the Eastern Front to try to confront Hitler and wrest control from him.
That winter of 1942, the German army came to a halt before the gates of Stalingrad. Even when the Sixth Army under General von Paulus faced certain defeat, Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal.
Mein einziger Bruder ist in Stalingrad geblieben und mein Mann hat immer die letzten Funksprüche, die von der Armee kamen, von Paulus zum Hauptquartier Ost kamen, die hat er uns immer nach meiner Mutter und mir durchgesprochen. Die haben wir alle gekriegt, das war so schrecklich. Und der ist auch vermisst, also mein Bruder ist nie wieder nach Hause gekommen. Also eine ganze Armee opferte, aus Prestigegründen.
Stauffenberg was now convinced that Hitler had to be removed. He was so vocal in his criticism that his fellow officers became concerned. It was decided to post him far away to the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia. In Libya and Tunisia, the victories of the famed Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel had been reversed. The Americans had landed in North Africa during Operation Torch. Rommel launched a daring panzer attack against the still inexperienced American troops, driving them all the way to the Kasserine Pass. But the victory was short-lived. The Germans began a fighting retreat. On the 7th of April, Stauffenberg tried to lead his column through the narrow El Hafe Pass. Fighter bombers caught up with him. Stauffenberg was badly injured. He was taken to a field hospital in Sfax, where he lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left hand, and his left eye. His recovery was slow but steady. On the 5th of July, he arrived back in Lautlingen for a month-long convalescence. Here, he was reunited with his children, Heimermann, Franz Ludwig, and little Valerie, as well as his niece Elizabeth and nephew Alfred. At around that time, the position of Chief of Staff of the General Army Office in the Bentleystrasse in Berlin became vacant. General Albrecht, well aware of Stauffenberg's commitment to remove Hitler, quickly arranged for Stauffenberg to be offered the post. Stauffenberg immediately agreed. In the August of 1943, Stauffenberg arranged to meet with Henning von Tresckow to discuss the implementation of the Valkyrie plan. They began to draft an outline of the new government that was to take charge immediately after the coup d'etat. General Ludwig Beck would become head of state. Longtime resistor Karl Friedrich Gödler would become Germany's new chancellor. Von Tresckow would take control of all German security services, including Himmler's Gestapo and SD. General Höppner would become head of the Ministry of War. Either Albrecht or Stauffenberg himself would serve as state secretary. The only minister in Hitler's government which the plotters intended to retain, if he agreed, was the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. Under his leadership, armaments production had actually increased despite the devastating British and American bombing campaigns.
I interviewed Albert Speer, and indeed he knew that he had been penciled in to become Minister of War in the new government had Hitler been assassinated, and all of that had been carried off successfully.
Stauffenberg increasingly became the core of the Valkyrie plan. But one major problem remained. Neither von Tresckow or other conspirators, such as Merz von Quernheim, had actual access to the Führer. But then, in June of 1944, Stauffenberg was appointed as Chief of Staff to none other than General Fromm, head of the Home Army. Hitler frequently wanted to be appraised of its combat readiness, so Stauffenberg suddenly found himself in a position where he himself would see Hitler on a regular basis. Of all the conspirators, he was now best placed to become the assassin. At the same time, Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B in France, had finally agreed to cooperate with the conspiracy, which in the West was headed by the military governor of France, General von Stulpnagel. The success of Valkyrie depended heavily on Stulpnagel and his deputy, none other than Stauffenberg's cousin, Cäsar von Hoffacker.
Stulpnagel was his immediate boss, and I think my father and Stulpnagel were very good friends at the end.
Another key figure in the conspiracy was General von Hasse, city commander of Berlin.
Hatte unterstand ihm ja der Valkyrie-Befehl und hatte Truppen, und mit diesen Truppen sollte zum Beispiel Goebbels festnehmen. Diesen Befehl durchzuführen, hatte den Oberst Rehmer, der ihm unterstand, beauftragt, Goebbels festzunehmen.
Where the plot began to fall down was that Stauffenberg couldn't be in two places at once. He was instrumental in organising the operation of Valkyrie in Berlin, so he needed to be there. He was a tremendously powerful, dynamic man, so he could, pick up the phone and talk to all corners of Germany at once and convince everybody to act in the way that they should do. But at the same time, he realised that summer that he actually had to be the assassin as well, so he also had to be 300 miles to the east, planting the bomb in the map room in Rastenburg.
Since Stauffenberg had to remain alive and return to Berlin to orchestrate the coup, he had to use a timer in the form of a fuse.
Und wir haben diese Versuche gemacht, wir hatten dänische, französische, belgische, alle Sprengstoffe, die es in Europa praktisch gab. Und die habe ich ausprobiert und habe dann nach einer Weile gemeldet, ohne jeden Drang und ohne jeden Druck, der englische wäre der beste und die Zünder auch, weil die Zünder leise waren, die konnte man nicht hören. Die anderen zischten. Und habe auch gemerkt, man müsste 2 Bomben gebrauchen mit 2 Zündern, also je einen Zünder, weil immer wieder eine Versager wäre. Aber mit 2 Bomben wäre man sicher.
Stauffenberg's co-conspirator, Helmut Stief, secured the necessary bombs and fuses from Lieutenant von Boeselager.
Hast du auch noch Englischen? Ja. Ja, dann pack den Handkoffer voll und bring den dem Stief. Da wusste ich, was los war. Da habe ich meinen Handkoffer genommen, so einen Wäschekoffer, wie man damals hatte, so einen Lederkoffer. Habe den vollgepackt mit englischen Bömmchen, das waren so Plastikdinger, viereckig. Mit den entsprechenden Zünder, habe den vollgepackt und bin also dann zum Stief geflogen.
The Valkyrie plan's objective was to decapitate the German leadership. Field Marshals von Kluge and Rommel insisted that not only Hitler, but also Himmler, head of the SS, and Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, should be too. The problem was that these 3 men were rarely together. On the 11th of July, Stauffenberg traveled to the Berghof with Stief. They were ready to detonate the bomb, but neither Himmler nor Göring were present. Stief decided to call it off. Three days later, Hitler moved his headquarters from the Berghof to Wolfschanze. Originally built in 1941 in preparation for Barbarossa, Wolfschanze had since been expanded into a vast complex comprising 3 security rings. The first complex, known as Security Zone 2, contained barracks and facilities for the staff as well as guests, a communications center and a mess hall known as Casino 2. To the northeast lay Security Zone 1, containing the offices of top figures in the Nazi leadership, including Göring, General Jodl and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. To the immediate left of Zone 1 was another highly guarded sector known as the Führerzone. Here was a huge bunker reserved for the Führer, as well as air raid shelters and various wooden barracks, one of which contained a map situation room. On the 14th of July, Stauffenberg and General Fromm were summoned to appear at Wolfschanze the next day. In this famous photo, Stauffenberg stands ramrod straight as Hitler greets General Bodenschatz of the Luftwaffe. Back in Berlin, General Olbricht was already issuing orders for Valkyrie. But Stauffenberg was once again prevented from setting the bombs because Himmler and Göring were not in attendance. But it gave Stauffenberg the opportunity of a dress rehearsal. He saw that the chance of activating the bomb in the Führer bunker itself was slim. He would have to break the fuses somewhere else, preferably in Keitel's office complex. He also saw that the distance between the 2 buildings was about 400 meters, which would take around 10 minutes on foot. A 10-minute fuse wouldn't do. He would need 30-minute fuses. On the morning of the 20th of July 1944, a Heinkel 111 carrying Stauffenberg and von Heften arrived at Rastenburg, the small airport serving Wolfschanze. Security was tight. Major Herbert Buchs remembers the mood at the Führer headquarters.
In the east, the situation was extremely critical. Also, the weather was very hot and the humidity high, conditions that Hitler didn't like. The overall mood in the Wolfschanze was tense.
I didn't know that my husband was going to try the assassination himself. He did tell me that in case the attempt should fail, I shouldn't try to be loyal to him. The most important thing was, he said, that one of us should survive to look after the children.
Stauffenberg sat down for breakfast. Joining him was Captain von Moellendorf, adjutant to the Wolfschanze commander. Shortly after 11 o'clock, accompanied by von Heften, Stauffenberg proceeded to the office of Wilhelm Keitel in preparation for the presentation to the Führer. Here, Stauffenberg received some disturbing news. The conference would not take place in the bunker, as usual, but in a wooden building, reinforced with concrete, known as the Lagerbaracke, or Situation Room. Keitel was then told that the briefing had been rescheduled for 12:30 p.m., given the pending visit of Mussolini. He decided that they should get over to the conference room as soon as possible. The bomb had to be activated immediately. Stauffenberg asked if he could change his shirt. Von Freyen took the officers to a nearby bedroom. Once inside the room, Heften and Stauffenberg feverishly began to activate the bomb. Stauffenberg used a special pair of pliers to squeeze the casings of the British fuse. Heften then took the fuse to insert it into the bomb. At that moment, Voss tried to open the door to tell Stauffenberg of a phone call. Von Heften had just finished activating the first bomb, but the second fuse hadn't been crushed. Keitel was impatient and told Stauffenberg to hurry. They'd run out of time. One bomb would have to do. Von Freyen offered to carry Stauffenberg's briefcase. Stauffenberg refused. "I want to sit as close to the Führer as possible," he said. "My hearing is very bad." When they reached the conference room, Hitler was listening to a report by General Adolf Huesinger, a friend of Tresco's, and the only general in the room who was aware that a plot to kill Hitler was brewing. To Huesinger's right were Colonel Heinz Brandt, Colonel Rudolf Schmund, a senior adjutant, Colonel Heinrich Borgmann of the Wehrmacht, and a stenographer, Berger, as well as other officers. To Hitler's left were General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, and his deputy, General Wallemont. Neither Goering nor Himmler were present, but Stauffenberg knew he must proceed. Von Freyen stepped forward and asked Oberst von Brandt to move aside so that Stauffenberg could be closer to Hitler. With the bomb in place, Stauffenberg told von Freyen that he had to make a phone call and left. Fatefully, Brandt moved back into his old spot. Once outside, Stauffenberg quickly made his way out of the Führer zone to the adjutant's building, where he knew General Feldgiebel would be waiting for him. Back in the conference room, Huesinger's presentation continued. The seconds ticked by.
Glass and wood splinters shot through the air. The large table on which all the situation maps were spread collapsed. After a few seconds of silence, I heard a voice saying, "Where's the Führer?"
In the turmoil that followed, Stauffenberg and von Heften made their escape. As they passed the site of the Situation Barracks, Stauffenberg saw a corpse covered with Hitler's long trench coat being carried out on a stretcher. At the first security ring, and later at the second checkpoint, they were allowed to proceed. The Wolfschanze commandant had ordered a complete lockdown. At the last checkpoint, Stauffenberg was stopped. He decided to call the commander himself. By coincidence, he was put through to Captain von Moellendorff, the officer with whom he had had breakfast earlier that morning. Von Moellendorff gave him the go-ahead to leave the compound. On the way to the airport, von Heften opened his briefcase and threw the second bomb into the woods. Their Heinkel took off at 1:15 p.m. Back in Wolfschanze, Feldgiebel noticed that something was very wrong. A rumor was going around that Hitler was very much alive and only slightly injured. Although a communications blackout was in effect, the news reached Bentleystrasse that the plot may have failed. General Albrecht decided to wait with launching Valkyrie until Stauffenberg could report in person. When Stauffenberg landed in Berlin, he found that nothing had been done. Precious hours had been wasted, during which the conspirators had had the element of surprise. General Fromm, commander of the Home Army, refused to activate Plan Valkyrie. He said that he had just spoken with Keitel and was told that the Führer was very much alive. Stauffenberg thought he had seen Hitler's corpse with his own eyes, and that the news from Wolfschanze was a trick. Anxious to wash his hands of the entire affair, Fromm ordered all the conspirators to be placed under arrest. But Stauffenberg put Fromm under arrest instead. Together with Albrecht and Merz von Quernheim, Stauffenberg frantically began to issue the telex orders to the various army units, urging them to move to their assigned locations. In Paris, all went according to plan.
My father went ahead and arrested all the major people of the SS and the Gestapo in Paris. And then they had the problem to solve because General Field Marshal Kluge, who was the head of the military in France, he had known about the resistance, but he had not definitely decided. And then there's that famous word, Kluge, that's very often cited, gentlemen, as long as that pig lives, I cannot. And you know that Kluge committed suicide just 4 weeks after that. So my father and Stülpnagel went back to Paris, and they had to open the prison doors.
The clatter of typewriters in the Bendlerstrasse came to a halt when Radio Berlin issued a communiqué. There had been an attempt on the Führer's life, but Hitler was alive and would speak on the radio shortly. Not one, but a sequence of events had doomed the conspiracy. The first factor was von Feyen's decision to place Stauffenberg to the right of Hitler, next to Huizinga. When later Brandt kicked his foot against the briefcase, he moved it to the right of the wooden post, which then served to shield Hitler from the blast. Had Stauffenberg been placed to Hitler's left, it is possible that the blast would have injured Hitler far more severely, even fatally. Significantly, all of the officers killed in the blast were standing to the right of the briefcase bomb, unshielded by any of the wooden posts. The second setback was the phone call from Feldgiebel, compounded by Keitel's impatience, which prevented the activation of the second bomb. If Stauffenberg had been able to place both bombs in the conference room, the likelihood is that Hitler would have been killed. But the most important factor was the decision to move the meeting from the bunker to the wooden conference room. Had the bomb exploded within the concrete confines of the bunker, the blast would have been contained, and everyone in the room would have been killed. Hitler was convinced that he had been saved by Providence. Shaking hands with his left arm, since his right arm was hurt in the explosion, he proudly welcomed his guest, Italy's ex-dictator Benito Mussolini.
As Hitler showed Mussolini the ruins of the barracks, he said, "You see, there's nothing left of it, and yet I got out without a scratch." In truth, he had injured his shoulder, so he put his right hand between the buttons of his tunic, like Napoleon. Until then, everyone was convinced that it must have been one of the laborers working on the barracks. But the sudden disappearance of Stauffenberg put things in an entirely different light. By that evening, Hitler knew that a clique of army officers had been responsible.
Back in Berlin, the final act had begun. Major Rehmer, who had defied von Haase's orders, had arranged his troops around the Bendlerstrasse. Soon thereafter, Rehmer's forces were relieved by the SS. Valkyrie was lost. Fromm was released and promptly ordered the conspirators to be placed under arrest. Eager to cover up his complicity, Fromm decided to dispose of the conspirators immediately, so that none of them could implicate him in the investigation that was sure to follow. Stauffenberg, Heften, Olbricht and Quernheim were summarily condemned to death. An execution detail was formed, lit by the headlights of SS vehicles. They were then marched to the courtyard of the Bendler block. At the same time, Hitler was making his radio address from Wolfschanze.
Die selbst sind unverletzt. Ganz lange Autoschöpfung und Brennung und der Verbrennung. Ich fasse das als eine Bestätigung des Auftrags der Vorstellung auf, mein Lebensziel weiter zu verfolgen, so wie ich es bisher getan habe.
Long live our sacred Germany!
It was 1 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of July, 1944. Fate had perhaps been merciful to Claus von Stauffenberg. Many other senior officers were not so lucky. The attempt convinced Hitler that the Wehrmacht leadership could not be trusted. He launched a purge of the officer corps and used the shock of the attack to also round up all the surviving members of the old opposition in the Reichstag. Those officers who had been injured or killed by the bomb were hailed as heroes. Hitler went in person to the Rastenburg hospital to pay his respects to them. Hitler ordered a series of show trials in the Volksgerichtshof, or People's Court, presided over by a dreaded judge, Roland Freisler.
Also, und werden Sie hier nicht unverschämt! Mit Ihnen werden wir fertig!
Even high-ranking officers like Field Marshal von Witzleben were forced to wear shabby, ill-fitting clothes, stripping them of their former dignity.
Mein Mann hat man dann am selben Tag noch hingerichtet. Und dort durfte er dann das erste Mal und das letzte Mal noch Abschiedsbriefe schreiben. Und hat das auch getan. Er hat einen zweiten geschrieben, weil er sagt, es sind noch 5 Minuten Zeit Und ich weiß nicht, ob mein erster Brief ankommt, deswegen schreibe ich den nochmal. Das sind sehr bewegende, 5 Minuten vorm Tod geschrieben, sehr bewegende Briefe.
The war continued for another 10 months.